What if there were once 4 great empires in the ancient world, not 3, not the comfortable triad of Rome, Persia and China that schoolbooks still rehearse, but 4? And what if the 4th, the one no one taught you to remember, did not stand on the steppes of Asia or the cold edge of the Mediterranean, but rose instead in the highlands of northeast Africa, raised obelisks taller than anything Rome ever built upright, minted its own coins in gold and silver and Greek-lettered bronze, and was named in a sentence that still survives in old papyrus, alongside the 3 powers history later chose to honour? What if you have walked your entire life beside a missing pillar of the world and never once felt the shadow of it fall across you? There is a name for this empire. It is not a name most people recognise. It is not whispered in the same Sunday school cadence as Babylon or Troy. It does not echo in poetry the way Carthage echoes, even though Carthage was burned to its salt and this kingdom was not. It survived. It outlived Rome by centuries. It baptized itself before Constantine did, lit candles in stone churches before most of Europe could spell the word for prayer, and yet, somewhere between the closing of the Red Sea trade and the tightening of European ink, it was quietly removed from the 4 corners of memory and made into a curiosity, a footnote, a thing tourists photograph without quite knowing what they are looking at. A Persian prophet named Mani, writing in the 3rd century after Christ, is said to have looked at the world and counted its great kingdoms. He counted Rome, he counted Persia, which was his own. He counted the middle kingdom of the Chinese, and then, without hesitation, he counted 4th, a kingdom in Africa whose ships moved frankincense and ivory across the Erythraean Sea, whose kings called themselves Nagusa Nagast, King of Kings, in deliberate echo of imperial titles older than their own. That kingdom, in his telling, was not minor. It was not provincial. It was not, as later European cartographers like to imply, a curious tribal polity dressed in misunderstood finery. It was, in the eye of someone who had no reason to flatter it, equal to Rome. How does an empire that equal disappear? That is the question this long, slow night will turn around. Not toward a single answer. There will be no clean answer, and the absence of one is part of why the story still hums beneath the surface of what people think they know, but toward many smaller questions, layered like stones in a wall whose builders are gone. Why does almost no Western child grow up hearing this name? Why are the obelisks of Aksum less famous than the obelisks of Egypt, when some of them were carved later, taller and more delicately than anything along the Nile? Why does a port called Adulis, once the busiest African gateway between the Mediterranean and India, no longer appear on the mental maps that ordinary travellers carry inside their heads? And why, when the answer to the last of these is searched honestly, does it seem to lead again and again not to the failures of the empire itself, but to the choices of those who came afterward? Choices about what to write down, what to translate, what to teach, and what to allow to fade into the dust of catalogue drawers and colonial museums. There will be no rush in this telling. The night is long, and the stones are old, and the kind of listening this story asks for is not the kind one does sitting upright. So before going further, before letting the body settle into whatever softness has been arranged for it, there is a small and honest request. If something in this slow unfolding draws you in, if the rhythm of these questions feels worth coming back to, please consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel, but only if you genuinely enjoy what is being made here. There is no need to perform interest. Honest attention is the only payment that matters, and if it would feel right, leave a small note somewhere in the comments. Your city, your local hour, the weather outside the window where you're listening from. There is something quietly beautiful about strangers across the world dimming their lights at the same moment leaning into the same forgotten name. It is, in its own modest way, a small reversal of the erasure this story is about, because erasure, when one looks at it closely, is rarely the work of a single decision. It is rarely the burning of a library or the toppling of a statue. It is more often the slow work of preference, of which travellers are translated, which kings are named, which coins are kept in lit cases at the front of a museum, and which are stored in drawers behind a service door. It is the quiet selection of what counts as the centre of the world, and for a very long time. When European hands began drawing the maps that the modern mind still leans on, the highlands of northeast Africa were drawn small, not absent, just small. Just unimportant enough that no one would think to ask what stood there. What stood there was a city. The city's name was Aksum. Its kings wore double crowns of gold. Its merchants spoke Greek and Sabaean and a script of their own called Girez, which is still chanted today in the liturgies of churches that have not closed in 1700 years. Its monuments outlasted its empire. Its empire outlasted the Romans who admired it. And then, somewhere in the long centuries after, a quiet decision was made about how much of all of this the world would be allowed to remember. The question is whether that decision can still be undone, whether listening now in the dark in whatever city the listener happens to be in, the act of returning attention to a name long dimmed is, in some small way, an act of repair. The stones at Aksum still stand, some of them. They are waiting the way patient things wait. They have been waiting for a very long time. There is a strange logic that runs beneath the maps of the ancient world, an unspoken assumption that civilizations rise where rivers run wide and lowlands open into floodplains. Egypt along the Nile, Mesopotamia between its two rivers, the Indus through its alluvial plain, the Yellow River bending through northern China. By that logic, the highlands above the Red Sea should have remained empty of any city worth remembering. They are too high, the air thins, the rains arrive in a rhythm that punishes anyone who plants by lowland habit. The volcanic soil is rich, but the slopes are steep and the streams cut downward in canyons that resist irrigation. A traveller standing in the middle of the Tigray plateau, even today, would see a landscape that rewards patience and punishes presumption. Not the kind of land that grows empires the way the Nile Delta grew them, almost by accident, almost by gravity. And yet, somewhere between the 3rd century before Christ and the 1st century after, a city did rise there. It rose at an elevation higher than any city in modern Europe. It rose without a great river beside it. It rose with no obvious reason that the maps of the ancient world should have noticed it at all. And yet, by the time the Greek merchant who wrote the Periplus of the Erythraean Sea sat down to record what he'd seen, this city had become a name worth recording, and its king a figure worth describing, and its trade a current worth measuring. How does that happen? How does a stone city appear on a high plateau and begin minting coins in 3 languages, and the world's later historians pay it less attention than they pay to towns whose ruins are smaller, whose coinage is poorer, whose fame in their own time was thinner? To approach that question honestly, one has to walk backward through the silence that precedes Aksum itself. Before the kingdom whose name survives on coins, there was something older in the same highlands. Archaeologists, when they began digging seriously in the 20th century, found temples at a place called Yeha, and an inscription speaking of a kingdom called Dumt, and these things date back roughly to the 8th century before Christ, perhaps earlier. The ruins at Yeha include a temple of dressed limestone whose precision of joinery would not have shamed a builder in Greece. There are ibex motifs carved into its altars. There are inscriptions in a South Arabian script. There are signs of contact, perhaps migration, perhaps something more entangled between the people of the African highlands and the people of southern Arabia just across the Strait of Bab el-Mandeb. where the Red Sea narrows to a passage a swimmer in good shape might almost cross. What this means is that by the time Aksum rises into the recorded world, it is rising onto soil already worked by an older civilization whose name survives only in fragments. Demt is not Aksum. Demt is something earlier and quieter and stranger. It seems to have flourished and faded with that particular silence that descends on cultures whose own writings are too few to argue back against the writings of others. There is no Domt epic. There are no Domt kings whose biographies have come down. There are only stones and inscriptions, and the unsettling realization that whoever they were not primitive. They built straight walls, they cut precise corners, they worshipped in temples that suggest a settled religious imagination, not the improvised altars of wandering bands. Then, between roughly the 4th century before Christ and the 1st century after, the historical record in the highlands goes dim. Not absent, but dim. Cities seem to shrink, inscriptions become rare, the temples at Yeha are no longer being added to. And then, almost without warning, in the documents of the wider world, a new name surfaces, and the new name is Aksum, and it is already, when it surfaces, behaving like a city that has been growing in the dark. There is something in this rhythm that resembles the rhythm of other forgotten transitions in history. A culture seems to pause, a landscape seems to empty, and then, when the records resume, the descendants are already mature, already minting coinage, already trading with distant powers, already speaking a language whose grammar has had centuries to settle. What happened in the gap? Was it a slow consolidation, the smaller chiefdoms of the highlands gradually absorbing one another the way the early Latin cities absorbed each other into Rome? Was it a population shift? Perhaps a return migration from across the Red Sea? Perhaps an internal movement upward into the cooler altitudes as the lowlands grew harsher? Or was it something more deliberate? A conscious project of city building by an elite whose names have not survived because the writing of that period has not survived? The honest answer is that no one knows. The honest answer is that the gap remains a gap, and the gap is not a small one. It is several centuries wide. And in that silence, the foundation of one of the great forgotten empires of the world was laid. What is striking in the slow accumulation of evidence is how unwilling later European scholarship was to even ask the question. When the first colonial era Europeans began to study Aksum in the 18th and 19th centuries, the assumption they brought with them was that a civilization this sophisticated, in this part of Africa, must have been the product of outside influence. South Arabian colonists, Phoenician traders, lost Israelite tribes, anyone, anywhere, except the people who actually lived in the highlands. The possibility that the inhabitants themselves had built it slowly, across centuries, through the same kind of cultural ferment that had built every other ancient city, was set aside as if it were too unlikely to consider. That assumption left a residue in the scholarship that took most of the 20th century to clean off, and some would say it has not been entirely cleaned off even now. So when the question is asked, how did a Mediterranean-scale civilization arise on a plateau where logic said none should rise? Part of the answer must be that the question itself is shaped by an older bias. The plateau was not empty. The plateau had been inhabited, worked, built upon, prayed in, written about for at least 1,000 years before Aksum. The empire did not appear out of nothing. It appeared out of a silence that had been imposed, in part by time, and in part by the choices of those who came later to read the silence. What rose, when it rose, was not a miracle. It was a city, but the silence around its rising, that, perhaps, is something else. That is something that asks to be looked at more closely, because silences in history are rarely accidental, and the silence before Aksum is one of the longest and one of the most carefully unexamined in the recorded memory of the continent. There is a story that the Ethiopians themselves have told about the origin for at least 700 years, and possibly far longer, and it is a story that sits awkwardly between scripture, dynasty, and dream. The story is preserved in a book called the Kebra Nagast, The Glory of Kings, compiled in its present form in the 14th century but drawing on traditions that are demonstrably much older. The story tells of a queen who ruled in the highlands and the lowlands surrounding them, a queen whose name in the Ethiopian telling is Makeda, and whose name in the Hebrew Bible is rendered only as the Queen of Sheba. The story tells of her journey north to the court of Solomon in Jerusalem, of the gifts she brought, of the wisdom she sought, and of the son she bore on her return, a son who in the telling was called Menelik, and who became the first emperor of a line that claimed, with extraordinary consistency, to have ruled Ethiopia until the deposition of Haile Selassie in 1974. 3,000 years of dynastic continuity traced back to a single bedroom in Jerusalem. It is the kind of story that historians, trained in the modern habit of separating myth from fact, are quick to set aside. And yet, when one sets it aside, one finds that the setting aside leaves a strange hollow in the soil, because something has to explain the persistence of the claim. Something has to explain why a Christian kingdom on the African continent would, century after century, insist upon a Jewish royal genealogy as the foundation of its legitimacy. The claim is unusual. It does not flatter, it does not align with the expansion of Islam to its north and east, or with the Christianity of Byzantium that arrived later by sea. It points stubbornly to a moment in the early first millennium before Christ, a moment when, according to the Hebrew text itself, a queen from the south did travel to Solomon, bearing camels laden with spices and gold and precious stones, and asked him questions that, the text says, no one before her had thought to ask. Where did she come from? The Hebrew word is Sheba. The South Arabian Peninsula contains a kingdom whose ancient name was Saba, and whose ruins at Marib in modern Yemen include the broken remains of a great dam and the foundations of temples to a moon god whose worship spread across the strait into the African highlands. This is the conventional answer. Sheba was Saba, the queen was Arabian, and yet the Ethiopian tradition has never accepted this answer, and the Ethiopian tradition has, in its corner of the world, the longer continuous memory. The Ethiopian tradition insists that the queen ruled on both sides of the Red Sea, that her capital was in the African highlands, and that the kingdom she governed extended across the narrow water into what is now Yemen. Is there any evidence for this beyond legend? There is, of a sort, and the evidence is the kind that does not settle the question but refuses to let it close. The script of ancient South Arabia, the Sabaean script, is found inscribed on stones in the Ethiopian highlands in the same period when it was being inscribed in Yemen. The temple at Yeha, whose limestone walls still stand, was built in a style indistinguishable from the temples of Marib. The names of certain deities, Al-Maka, the moon god, appear on both sides of the strait. A culture spanned the water. Whether the political centre of that culture was on the African side or the Arabian side is a question the inscriptions themselves do not resolve, because the inscriptions speak of kings without always specifying where those kings sat. There may have been one kingdom that straddled the Red Sea. There may have been two kingdoms in close communion. There may have been something in between, a confederation, a dual monarchy, a situation that does not map neatly onto modern ideas of national borders. What is interesting is that the Kebra Nagast, when it tells the story of Makeda, does not claim she was Arabian or African in the sense those terms would later acquire. It claims something stranger and more revealing. It claims that the kingdom she ruled was the place where, eventually, the Ark of the Covenant would come to rest. It claims that her son Menelik travelled to Jerusalem as a young man, was anointed by his father Solomon, and brought back with him, or was given by divine arrangement, depending on which version of the text one reads, the original Ark, leaving a replica behind in the temple. The Ark in this telling has been in Ethiopia ever since. It is said to rest in a small chapel beside the Church of Our Lady Mary of Zion in Aksum itself. A single monk is said to guard it. He never leaves the chapel, and after his death another is appointed who never leaves either, and so the chain of guardianship continues, unbroken, across the centuries. This is not a claim that historians can verify. It is also not a claim that has ever been seriously withdrawn. The Ethiopian Orthodox Church has held to it, calmly and without need for argument, for as long as records exist of the Church's teachings. The chapel exists, the guardian exists. What is inside the chapel has not been opened to outside examination in the modern era. The most that can be said is that the claim is older than most of the institutions that would dismiss it, and that the persistence of the claim, across a millennium and a half, is itself a historical fact that deserves to be looked at without the easy reflex of skepticism. What does it mean for a kingdom to ground its identity in such a story? It means, perhaps, that the kingdom understood something about origins that the secular age has begun to forget. That an empire is not only a thing of armies and coins, but a thing of stories told in long succession about who one's people are and where they come from, and what they were entrusted with at the beginning. Aksum, in its own self-understanding, was not simply a polity that grew out of the highlands. It was a polity that traced itself, by an unbroken thread, to the most powerful king in the Hebrew scriptures, and to a queen whose name in the Ethiopian memory was a name in its own right, not a placeholder for an unnamed visitor from the south. Whether Makeda lived as the Kebra Nagast describes her, whether Menelik truly carried the ark down to the highlands, whether any of it happened in the way the story tells, these are questions that recede the more one approaches them. What does not recede is the realization that an empire told this story about itself, and lived inside it, and built churches and dynasties and laws inside the architecture of that telling. To dismiss the story is, in some real sense, to dismiss the empire's own self-knowledge, and in dismissing that self-knowledge, the modern historian risks doing exactly what colonial scholarship did before, replacing what the people of the place said about themselves with what outsiders found more convenient to believe. The queen may or may not have existed in the way the legend describes, but the legend itself existed and shaped a civilization and survives in stone and enchant into the present hour. That, at least, is something the dust cannot erase. There is a field outside the modern town of Aksum where stones lie that should not be possible. Some of them stand. Some of them have fallen. The largest of the fallen ones lies broken into segments along the grass, like a felled tree of granite, and if one walks its length from base to tip, one walks the length of more than a city block. It is in its unbroken state the largest single piece of stone that any ancient civilization is known to have attempted to raise upright. Anywhere in the world, it weighs, by the most careful modern estimates, somewhere in the neighbourhood of 500 tons. The Egyptians, for all the fame of their obelisks, never tried to lift anything that heavy. The Romans never tried. The builders of the great cathedrals of the European Middle Ages never tried. And yet someone, in a city in the African highlands, in roughly the 4th century after Christ, gave the order, and the stone was quarried and dressed, and moved across kilometres of broken country, and set into a base, and stood up against the sky. And then, perhaps in the act of raising it, perhaps later, it fell, and it has lain on the grass at Aksum ever since. The strange part is not only that it was attempted, The strange part is how little is known about how it was done. There are no inscriptions describing the engineering. There are no contemporary accounts in Greek or Latin or Ge'ez that explain the technique. There is no record of the labour force, no estimate of the time required, no fragment of an architect's name. The stones were raised, and the knowledge of how was either never written down, or was written down in some text that has not survived, or was held within a guild whose members took it with them when the empire fell. What remains is the stones themselves, mute and impossibly heavy, holding their secret with the patience of geology. Several of them still stand. The tallest of the standing stelae, the term scholars use for these monuments, though the word seems too thin for objects of this scale, rises about 24 metres above the field. That is taller than an 8-storey building. It is carved on its faces to resemble, almost playfully, a multi-storey structure with what look like rows of windows and even small carved doors at its base, as if the stone were imitating in its single piece the very architecture it stood among. The visual effect is uncanny. It is a tower pretending to be a building, or a building compressed into a tower, and the longer one looks at it, the harder it becomes to say which intention came first. The stelae are not pillars in the Greek sense, not columns supporting anything, not memorials in any straightforward way. They are something else, and the something else has not been entirely decoded. What were they for? The conventional answer is that they were grave markers, that the largest of them stood above the burial chambers of Aksumite kings, and that the carved windows and doors represent the stone houses of the dead. Beneath the field, in fact, there are chambers. Excavations have found them. There are passages cut into the bedrock, sealed with stone slabs, containing fragments of grave goods and the residue of what once were the bodies of people whose names have not survived. So the burial marker theory has substance, but it leaves much unexplained. It does not explain why the stones had to be so impossibly large. It does not explain why the largest of them appears to have been abandoned in the act of raising, as if the kingdom had attempted, at the height of its ambition, to do something even it could not finish, and then never tried again. It does not explain the carved windows. It does not explain why no other African civilization, before or after, attempted anything quite like it. The largest fallen stele lies in pieces. The break pattern suggests that it shattered when it fell. Some scholars have argued that it broke during the raising itself, that the engineers, having chosen a stone too ambitious even for their skill, watched it crash to the ground and then never spoke of it again. Others have argued that it stood for a time, perhaps generations, and fell later, perhaps in an earthquake. The truth has not been established and may not be establishable. What is established is that the second largest stele, which still lay broken on the ground in the 20th century, was carried off to Rome in 1937 by the army of Benito Mussolini, who saw in its conquest a colonial trophy and erected it in front of what is now a building of the Food and Agriculture Organization. It stood there for 68 years. In 2005, after a long negotiation, Italy returned it. It was reassembled in Aksum, where it now stands again. The journey of that stone from the African highlands to a fascist capital and home again at the beginning of the 21st century is a small, hard parable about how the monuments of erased empires travel through history. How were they raised? Modern engineers have studied the question. Some have proposed earthen ramps, the technique long assumed for the Egyptian pyramids, though the Aksumite landscape does not show clear evidence of such ramps having been built. Others have proposed lever systems, gradual lifting, sandpit methods in which the stone is brought to vertical by progressively removing the support from beneath it. None of these proposals can be tested without doing the lift again, and no one in the modern era has been willing to commit the resources to attempt a 500-ton lift simply to satisfy a historical curiosity. The engineering of Aksum in the end is a closed door. One can press against it and listen at it, but one cannot open it. There is one detail that is sometimes overlooked. The granite from which the stelae were carved was quarried at a site called Gobedra, several kilometres from where the stones now stand. The quarry is still there. One can walk to it. One can see in the rock face the channels where the stones were cut, and one can see, lying near the channels, blocks that were partly cut and then abandoned, as if the quarriers had paused at the end of a workday and never returned. To walk from the quarry to the field where the stelae stand, even on the modern road, takes the better part of an hour. To imagine moving a 500-ton block across that distance, on rollers or sledges or some method now unknown, with no power source other than human and animal muscle, is to imagine something that approaches the edge of what was supposed to have been possible in the ancient world. And yet they did it. They did it more than once. They left the evidence in the field, where it has been weathering for 1600 years, waiting for someone to ask the question with the seriousness it deserves. The stones do not answer. They only stand or lie, depending on which one is being asked. They are the largest unanswered question that the Empire of Aksum left behind, and they are unanswerable in part because the empire that raised them did not feel the need to explain itself. It assumed, perhaps, that those who came after would understand. That assumption, like so many of the assumptions of vanished civilizations, did not survive the centuries that followed. There is a sentence that ought to have changed the way the West looked at Africa, and somehow did not. The sentence is attributed to a Persian prophet named Mani, who lived in the 3rd century after Christ, and who was the founder of a religion that briefly rivaled Christianity in its reach across the ancient world before being almost entirely extinguished by the rising powers of Rome and Sasanian Persia. Mani was, by every account, a man of unusual learning. He had travelled, he had read, he had been a court figure under at least one Persian Shah before he fell out of favour and was eventually executed. And in one of the texts attributed to him, in a passage preserved through the long copying tradition of his followers, he gave his readers a list of the 4 great kingdoms of the world. He did not list 3. He did not pause and qualify. He listed Babylon and Persia in his time, and Rome and the kingdom of the Seleucid, which was his name for the Empire of China. And then he listed a 4th, and the 4th was the kingdom of Aksum. The sentence is preserved in fragments. The exact wording varies depending on the manuscript tradition, but the substance is consistent across the surviving witnesses, that in the eye of a learned man writing from the heart of the Persian world, Aksum stood among the 4. Not as a curiosity, not as a tributary, as one of the powers whose existence shaped the political imagination of the 3rd century world. The sentence has been quoted by modern scholars who study Aksum, and it has been quoted with a certain quiet astonishment, because it cuts so cleanly against the assumption with which most Western readers approach African history. Mani did not need to flatter Aksum. He had no diplomatic reason to elevate it. He was simply describing the world as he understood it, from a vantage point that was neither European nor African, and from that vantage point the count came out to 4. There is a temptation, when encountering a sentence like this, to treat it as a single anomalous testimony, the eccentric judgment of one religious teacher, perhaps overstating things for rhetorical effect. But the sentence does not stand alone. It is corroborated with varying degrees of directness by other voices from the same broad period. The author of the Periplys of the Erythraean Sea, a Greek-speaking merchant who probably wrote in the 1st century after Christ, described Aksum and its port at Adulis as an active node in the Indian Ocean trade, naming the king who ruled there and detailing the goods that passed through his hands. Pliny the Elder, writing in Latin, mentioned the kingdom in his natural history. Cosmas Indicopleustes, a 6th century traveller whose name itself means the one who sailed to India, made the journey to Adulis, copied an inscription that he found there on a stone throne, and recorded what he saw with the careful eye of a man who knew he was witnessing something important. The sources are not abundant, but they are not absent, and they speak with a consistency that the modern textbook silence has worked hard to obscure. What were they describing? They were describing a kingdom whose ships moved between the Roman world and the Indian world, brokering goods that neither side could easily acquire from the other. They were describing a court where Greek was spoken alongside Ge'ez, where envoys from distant powers were received with formal protocol, where a king sat on a throne carved with inscriptions that boasted, in 2 languages, of his conquests across the Red Sea and into the African interior. They were describing, in other words, an empire that behaved like an empire. The trappings were all there: the diplomatic correspondence, the standardized coinage, the monumental architecture, the expansionist campaigns, the international vocabulary of kingship. None of it was provincial. None of it suggested a small chiefdom dressed in foreign borrowings. The Aksumite kings, by the testimony of those who actually saw them, presented themselves as peers of the rulers of the major world powers, and were treated as such by those rulers. There is a Greek inscription still readable on a stone now housed in a museum, in which an Aksumite king named Ezana refers to himself by a title that translates roughly as King of Kings of Aksum, of Himyar, of Saba, of Salhen, of the Beja, of the Kasu, and of several other peoples whose names are now obscure. The list is the kind of list that imperial titles always become, an accumulation of conquered or claimed territories, designed to assert the breadth of one's authority across as many directions as possible. To a reader who knows what to listen for, the title sounds remarkably like the titles claimed by contemporary Persian and Roman rulers, who also stacked the names of their conquered peoples one upon another. The form was the same, the intention was the same, the grammar of empire was the same. So why, if the testimony is so consistent, has Aksum been so consistently demoted in the Western telling of the ancient world? Part of the answer, perhaps the largest part, is that the West did not arrive at its image of antiquity through a balanced reading of all available sources. It arrived through a tradition that ran from Greek and Roman writers, through Latin Christianity, through the Renaissance recovery of classical texts, through the Enlightenment and its particular preoccupations, into the modern academy. That tradition had its own centre of gravity. Its centre of gravity was the Mediterranean. Sources that lay outside that gravitational pull, sources in Ge'ez, in Coptic, in Syriac, in the Persian of Mani's followers, were treated as peripheral, as exotic, as supplementary at best. The four-kingdom sentence sat in those peripheral sources. It did not sit in Tacitus or Suetonius, and so it did not enter the imagination of the West with the weight it deserved. There is also something more uncomfortable to be said. The image of antiquity that took shape in the European mind during the centuries when European empires were extending themselves across the world had a use. It served, whether by intention or by drift, to support a certain story about the natural ordering of civilizations. In that story, the great empires of antiquity were placed where the European observer expected greatness to lie, around the Mediterranean, in Asia where exoticism could be admitted, in a small handful of authorized exceptions. An African empire equal to Rome did not fit the story. It contradicted assumptions about who built civilizations and who did not. And so the four-kingdom sentence, when it surfaced as a curiosity, an oddity, a footnote, rather than as the corrective it actually was. The shape of what is remembered in any era is shaped also by what it would be inconvenient to remember. Mani did not write to be inconvenient. He wrote what he saw. He saw 4 kingdoms, and one of them was on a plateau in northeast Africa, and that kingdom, in his moment, was not in decline. It was at the height of its powers. It would mint coins for another 3 centuries. It would convert to Christianity within a generation of his death. It would conquer a kingdom across the sea. And then, slowly, for reasons that are still not entirely understood, it would begin its long fade from the page, a fade that the centuries since have done very little to reverse, and that perhaps only the patient act of looking again can begin to undo. There is a stretch of coast on the African side of the Red Sea, in what is now the country of Eritrea, where the ground rises gradually from a salt-stung shoreline into the foothills that climb toward the Tigray Plateau. The wind there carries a particular smell, salt and dust, and the faint, dry, resinous note of acacia gum drifting down from the hills. If one stands on that shore today, one stands on what was once the busiest African port between the eastern Mediterranean and the Indian subcontinent. The port was called Adulis. The name appears on the periplus of the Erythraean Sea, on the inscriptions of Aksumite kings, on the maps that medieval Arab geographers later drew of the western Indian Ocean. It was, for several centuries, one of the great maritime gateways of the ancient world. And there is almost nothing of it now. The site has been excavated only intermittently. The stones lie half covered by sand and scrub. The shoreline itself has shifted. The harbour has silted. A traveller who arrived without knowing what to look for could walk past the place and never realise what had been there. This is the strange physical fate of Adulis. But the strange historical fate is even more striking. For the entire period during which it functioned as the principal Red Sea port of the Aksumite Empire, roughly the 1st through the 7th centuries after Christ, Adulis was not a peripheral curiosity. It was a central node in the long-distance trade that knit the ancient world together. Ships from Egypt and Roman Syria came down the Red Sea to load and unload there. Ships from the Indian coast, from Sri Lanka, from the Malabar pepper ports, came up across the Arabian Sea to meet them. Goods passed through Adulis that had been gathered from a hemisphere, frankincense and myrrh from southern Arabia, ivory from the African interior, gold from the rivers of what would later be called Sudan, obsidian from the Ethiopian highlands, and most unusually, live animals, including the elephants that the Aksumite kings traded as a kind of royal commodity to anyone who would buy them. The author of the Periplus of the Erythraean Sea, who saw the port in its working condition, described it with the precise eye of a merchant taking inventory. He listed what was sold there. He listed what was bought there. He named the king of the Aksumites and recorded that the king was a careful judge of trade, learned in Greek, and capable of conducting the affairs of his realm in the diplomatic language of the Eastern Mediterranean. The portrait that emerges, even from a few short paragraphs, is of a port that operated at the same level of sophistication as the great trading cities of the Roman world, not as a primitive outpost where exotic goods were bartered, but as a regulated market where prices were known, contracts were honoured, and a bilingual elite moved goods between continents with practised fluency. There is a stone, or rather there was a stone, that demonstrated this in the most direct way. Cosmas Indicopleustes, the 6th century traveller, recorded in his work known as the Christian Topography that when he arrived at Adulis, he was shown a marble throne inscribed in Greek, standing on the harbour front. The throne carried 2 inscriptions, one slightly older than the other. The first was an inscription of the Hellenistic king Ptolemy III of Egypt, boasting of his conquests in the 3rd century before Christ. The second was an inscription of an Aksumite king, written in Greek. listing his own conquests across both Africa and southern Arabia, and concluding with a dedication to the god Ares. The Greek name, in this case, applied to the Aksumite war deity Mahrem. Cosmas copied both inscriptions. The original throne has not survived, but the copy survives in his manuscripts, and through that copy a historian today can read, almost 6 centuries after it was first carved, the words an Aksumite king wished to have read by every merchant who landed in his port. What does it mean for an empire's principal harbour to display such a monument? It means that the empire understood itself to be in a long lineage of imperial powers and wished its visitors to understand the same. The throne was not erected for the local population. The local population could read Ge'ez. The throne was erected in Greek for the foreigners, for the Roman traders, the Indian merchants, the diplomats of the wider Mediterranean and Asian world. And its message was that the king who governed this port stood in a tradition that included Ptolemy himself. The gesture is as confident as anything one finds in the imperial inscriptions of Rome. It is the gesture of a kingdom that did not consider itself peripheral. The trade itself was vast. Roman gold flowed into Adulis in such quantities that the Aksumite mint was, for a time, one of the few in the world outside the Roman Empire to strike its own gold coinage. The coinage was struck on the Roman weight standard, designed to circulate alongside Roman currency in the markets of the Indian Ocean. This is a small detail with an enormous implication. It means that Aksum was integrated into the international monetary system of late antiquity, was recognized by its trading partners as a credible issuer of gold, and was striking coinage that would be accepted at face value by merchants from Alexandria to the Malabar coast. There are even now hoards of Aksumite gold coins that have been recovered from sites in southern India, where they were buried by the merchants who received them in payment and never managed to spend them again. The coins are physical proof of a commercial network whose existence European historiography spent a long time downplaying. What flowed in the other direction is harder to reconstruct because perishable goods leave fewer traces. But the lists in the Periplus and in later Arab geographers suggest that Aksum exported not only the goods of its own territory, but the goods that came up to it from deep inland Africa. Gold from the regions south and west of the empire, ivory from the elephant herds of the savannah, slaves in numbers that the texts do not always disclose but that the texts do acknowledge, tortoise shell, hippopotamus hide, rhinoceros horn, aromatics that the Roman pharmacopoeia required and could not produce for itself. The empire sat at the African end of a network that reached on its far side to the spice ports of southern India, and it took its commission from everything that passed through. This is the part of the story that is often missed when Aksum is mentioned in passing. It was not merely an inland kingdom that happened to have access to the sea. It was a maritime power in the sense that its prosperity and its political reach depended on the discipline with which it controlled a particular stretch of salt water. When that salt water was opened to its ships, the empire flourished. When that salt water began, in the 7th century, to close, through forces that will need their own slow telling, the empire began its long descent. The harbour silted. The walls fell. The marble throne was lost. The merchants who had filled the port with the languages of 3 continents went elsewhere, and the ground that had once been the African gateway to the Indian Ocean became, with terrible quietness, a stretch of empty coast, where the wind still carries that particular smell of salt and dust, and where, beneath the sand, the foundations of a forgotten capital wait for someone to remember them. Before Aksum rose to its full height, there was already an empire to its north and west, older by many centuries, whose existence is one of the great open secrets of African history. Its name was Kush. It had grown along the upper Nile, in what is now northern Sudan, from a deep antiquity whose beginnings reach back into the second millennium before Christ. It had built pyramids, more pyramids in fact than Egypt itself ever built, though smaller and steeper, with a particular angled silhouette that distinguishes them at a glance from their northern cousins. It had ruled Egypt itself, in the 8th and 7th centuries before Christ, as the 25th dynasty, when its kings sat upon the double throne of the Nile and its priests served in the temples at Karnak and Memphis. It had been driven back south by Assyrian invasion in the 7th century before Christ, but it had not died. It had retreated, regrouped, and rebuilt itself further upstream at a place called Meroe, where the Nile bends and the iron-bearing earth made possible a new and consequential industry. Meroe was a city of ironworkers. Its smelting furnaces produced metal in quantities that some archaeologists have compared to the iron output of contemporary Mediterranean polities. It was, in its own quiet way, an industrial centre of late antiquity, on a continent whose industrial achievements the modern textbooks have rarely been generous enough to acknowledge. For most of the period when Aksum was growing into its powers, Meroe was its older neighbour, wealthier, more populous, in command of a longer history. The two empires existed in parallel for several centuries. There is no evidence of regular conflict between them in the early period. They occupied different ecological niches, Meroe along the river, Aksum in the highlands, and their economic interests pointed in different directions. Meroe toward Egypt and the Mediterranean by river, Aksum toward Arabia and India by sea. They could have continued in this parallel existence indefinitely. They did not. In roughly the middle of the 4th century after Christ, a king of Aksum whose name was Esna, the same king whose multilingual inscriptions still survive, appears to have led a military campaign northward and westward into the territory of Meroe, and to have ended the Kushite kingdom in a manner that the surviving inscriptions describe with an unsettling matter-of-factness. The campaign is recorded on a stone in the city of Aksum itself, written in Ge'ez and in Greek, and the wording in the Greek version describes the destruction of cities, the killing of populations, the seizure of cattle, and the carrying away of captives. The inscription does not boast at length. It records, almost as a bookkeeper might record, what had been done. The Kushite kingdom, after this campaign, does not reappear in the records of the wider world. The pyramids at Meroe were left where they stood. The ironworking continued at a reduced scale under whatever local successors remained. But the political entity that had once ruled Egypt as the 25th dynasty, that had defied Assyria, that had held the Upper Nile for over 1,000 years, ceased to exist as a state. There is something profoundly disorienting about reading Ezana's inscription with the awareness that one is reading the death notice of a civilization older than Aksum itself. The two African empires met, one absorbed the other, and then, within the same broad century, the absorbing empire began the slow process by which it too would be forgotten. The pyramids at Meroe are still standing. They are visited by the trickle of tourists who make it that far up the Nile. They appear in occasional photographs, and most viewers encountering the photographs do not know what they are looking at. They assume the images are of Egypt. They've not been told otherwise. The 25th dynasty is mentioned, when it is mentioned at all, in a single paragraph of standard textbooks, often with a slight tone of historical surprise, as if the existence of African pharaohs were a curious anomaly rather than the natural product of a long indigenous tradition. What did the Aksumites take from Meroe when they ended it? Some scholars have suggested that the very confidence of the Aksumite imperial style, the multilingual inscriptions, the standardized coinage, the formal vocabulary of kingship, owed something to what its kings learned from absorbing a civilization whose own imperial vocabulary was much older. Others have argued that the influence ran the other way long before the conquest, with Meroitic ideas of sacred kingship travelling south into the Aksumite court through the trade routes that linked the Nile to the Red Sea. The honest answer is that the cultural traffic between the two empires is still being reconstructed, and the reconstruction is hampered by the fact that Meroitic writing, the script that the Kushites developed for their own language in the centuries after Egyptian dominance, has not been fully deciphered. Scholars can read the alphabet. Its phonetic values were worked out in the early 20th century, but they cannot reliably translate the texts. The Meroitic language has too few cognates in known languages, and the surviving corpus is too small to allow confident interpretation. So a civilization that wrote down its own history in its own script has left those writings legible to the eye but mute the understanding. One can sound out the words, one cannot know what they mean. This is the kind of detail that once registered is difficult to set aside. An empire that ruled the Upper Nile for a millennium, that built pyramids in numbers exceeding Egypt's, that produced iron at industrial scale, that briefly occupied the throne of the pharaohs themselves, and the writings that empire left behind are still, in the 21st century, an unsolved puzzle. There are perhaps a dozen languages in the world whose surviving texts cannot be read with confidence. Meroitic is among them. Lineae is another. The script of the Indus Valley civilization is a third. Each of these silences represents a chamber of human experience to which the modern world has no key. And the silence around Meroitic, like the silence around Aksum that came after, has a particular weight, because it is a silence about an African civilization that the modern world might prefer to keep silent. What is most haunting, perhaps, is the symmetry of the disappearance. Kush ruled the Nile for more than 1,000 years and ended in a single Aksumite campaign, whose inscription occupies a few lines on a stone. Aksum ruled the Red Sea for several centuries and ended in a slow fade whose causes historians are still arguing about. Two African empires of comparable scale to the great empires of their respective eras, each ended within roughly 300 years of the other. The continent kept producing civilizations afterward. The gold-rich kingdoms of West Africa, the Swahili city-states of the eastern coast, the great Zimbabwe of the southern interior, the Empire of Mali, whose ruler Mansa Musa briefly destabilized the gold markets of medieval Cairo. But the particular thread that ran from Kush to Aksum, the thread that had connected northeastern Africa to the central currents of the ancient Mediterranean and Indian world, was broken. And what broke it, in the end, was not an outside conqueror. It was the shifting weather of late antiquity, and the rising of new powers across the sea, and the slow erosion of trade routes that had carried the empire's wealth. Forces that will need their own examination, in their own time, before the full shape of the loss becomes visible. There is a coin in a museum case in Berlin, small enough to lie on the pad of a thumb, struck in gold sometime around the year 340 of the Common Era. On one face it bears the portrait of a king in profile, wearing a tall headdress and holding a wheat sheaf. The king's name, written around the edge in Greek letters, is Ezana. On the reverse face, in earlier issues of his coinage, there appears a particular emblem, the disc and crescent, the ancient sign of the Aksumite royal religion, drawn from the deeper Semitic and South Arabian traditions of celestial worship that the empire had inherited from its origins. But on later coins of the same king, struck only a few years afterward, the disc and crescent are gone. In their place there is a cross. The same king, the same mint, the same standard weight, the same Greek inscription, and yet the sky on the reverse of the coin has changed. A symbol that had stood for centuries had been removed, and a new symbol, brought from across the sea, had taken its place. This is the conversion of Aksum to Christianity, It is one of the earliest such conversions in the history of any state, earlier than the Edict of Thessalonica that made Christianity the official religion of the Roman Empire, contemporary with or slightly later than the conversion of Armenia, which is usually counted as the first officially Christian kingdom. Aksum was the second, or perhaps the third, depending on how one counts, and it accomplished this transformation not through a slow seepage of convert upward through the social layers, but through a single royal decision that was then ratified slowly in the religious life of the country it ruled. The story of how that decision came to be made has come down through several sources, and the sources differ in their details, but they agree on the outline. The most widely cited account is preserved in the writings of a 4th century church historian named Rufinus, who claimed to have heard the story from one of the men involved. The story, in his telling, runs something like this. A philosopher from Tyre, travelling on a Red Sea ship for purposes of study, anchored at a port along the African coast. There was an incident. Accounts vary as to whether the ship was attacked or merely involved in some kind of dispute with the local population, and most of the crew were killed. 2 young men, students or junior companions of the philosopher, survived. They were brought to the Aksumite court. One of them was named Odysseus. The other was named Frumentius. They were Christians. They were also, by the standards of the Aksumite court, educated young foreigners with useful skills, and they rose over time to positions of considerable influence in the royal household. They tutored the king's son. They handled correspondence in Greek. They became in effect secretaries to the throne. And in that capacity they began quietly to introduce the elements of Christian worship to the small community of foreign merchants and visitors who passed through the city. When the king's son grew up and took the throne, he had been raised in part by Christians, and he was disposed to receive their teaching seriously. Frumentius eventually travelled to Alexandria, was consecrated as bishop by the Patriarch Athanasius, and returned to Aksum to oversee the formal Christianization of the kingdom. The king on the throne at the moment of formal conversion was Ezana, whose coins, as the museum case in Berlin makes clear, record the transition with unusual precision. This is the conventional telling. It is the telling preserved in the Greek and Latin Christian sources, and it is the telling that has been repeated in most modern accounts. But there is a question worth asking, which is what the Ethiopian sources themselves say about the same period. The Ethiopian sources, the chronicles, the synaxaria of the church, the accumulated traditions of the monastic communities, tell the story differently in certain respects. They emphasize the role of Frumentius, whom they call Abba Salama, the Father of Peace, but they also place the conversion in a much longer arc, one that includes the earlier introduction of monotheistic ideas through the Solomonic descent that the Kebra Nagast preserves, and that treats the formal conversion of Ezana as the completion of a process whose roots ran centuries deeper into the religious life of the highlands. There is something to be said for taking the Ethiopian sources seriously here, even when they cannot be independently verified. The kingdom was not, by the time of Ezana, a culture without religious depth. It had its own pantheon, its own temples, its own priestly traditions, its own carefully maintained relationship between the throne and the divine. The shift from the disk and crescent to the cross was not a simple matter of replacing one set of symbols with another. It was a renegotiation of an entire understanding of what the king was, and what the gods were, and how the two related. Such renegotiations do not happen in any society on the strength of a single charismatic missionary alone. They happen because something in the existing religious imagination of the place was already prepared for the new vocabulary. What that something was, in the Aksumite case, is one of the genuinely interesting unanswered questions of the empire's religious history. What is unmistakable is that after the conversion, Aksum became something almost without parallel in the late antique world, a Christian state on the African continent, in continuous communion with the Patriarchate of Alexandria, but isolated from the European centres of Christian power and developing across the centuries that followed a liturgical and theological tradition uniquely its own. The Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo Church traces its formal foundation to this moment. Its priests still chant in Ge'ez, the language of the Aksumite court. Its calendar still follows a system rooted in the older Coptic calendar of Alexandria. Its theology preserves doctrinal positions, particularly on the nature of Christ, that diverge from the formulations adopted at Chalcedon in 451, and that the Ethiopian Church has held to ever since. It is, in other words, a Christianity that branched from the central tree of late antique Christian thought, before that tree took its more familiar Mediterranean shape, and grew its own branches in its own direction, and is still growing them. What was lost in the change? It is hard to say with precision, because the older religion of the highlands was not extensively documented even in its own time, and the documentation that existed has not survived in significant quantity. Some inscriptions to the older deities remain, scattered on stones in the archaeological record. Some of the imagery, the disc and crescent, the bull, the ibex, persisted in folk art for generations after the conversion. But the priesthoods that had served the old gods are gone, and their rituals are gone, and what they understood about the heavens and the earth has not been preserved. There is, in the foundation of the Aksumite Church, the silent absence of an older religious world, layered beneath it, the way new cathedrals were so often built over the temples of the gods they replaced. The cross that replaced the crescent on the coins of Ezana is a small object. It carries on its small face the weight of a great forgetting. There is a small chapel in the city of Aksum set within the precincts of the Church of Our Lady Mary of Zion that no foreign scholar has been permitted to enter in living memory. The chapel is rectangular, modestly sized, with a fenced courtyard around it and a single doorway that opens only to admit the man who lives inside. He's called the Guardian, and his role is the only one of its kind in the world. He never leaves the enclosure. His meals are brought to him. His communication with the outside world is conducted through a small window or through speech across the fence. When he grows old, he names a successor. The successor enters the chapel before the old guardian dies, so that the line of guardianship is never broken even for a single hour. This system has been in place, by the testimony of the Ethiopian Orthodox Church, for an unbroken span of centuries, and the object the guardian protects is, according to that church, the original Ark of the Covenant, the chest described in the book of Exodus, said to have contained the tablets of the law given to Moses on the mountain of Sinai, last spoken of in the Hebrew scriptures in connection with the destruction of the first temple in Jerusalem in 586 before the Common Era. This is by any measure an extraordinary claim. It is also, when examined carefully, one of the more interesting puzzles in the historiography of late antiquity, because it occupies a peculiar position. It cannot be verified, because the object is not available for examination. It cannot be falsified, because no one has been permitted close enough to demonstrate that what is in the chapel is not what the church says it is, and it has not been withdrawn or qualified by the institution that maintains it, even in eras when other ancient institutions have quietly modernized away their more difficult traditions. The Ethiopian Church has held the claim with a steadiness that is, in itself, a historical fact worth examining. Where did the claim come from? The fullest version is preserved in the Kebra Nagast, The Glory of Kings, the same 14th century compilation that records the legend of Makeda and Solomon. According to the text, the young Menelik travelled north to meet his father, was anointed by Solomon as a king in his own right, and on his return journey was accompanied by the firstborn sons of the Israelite priesthood. These young men, the text says, took the original ark from the temple in Jerusalem and brought it south, leaving a replica in its place. The ark travelled through Egypt, across the Red Sea, and was installed in the African highlands, where it has remained ever since. The text describes the journey in detail. It describes the rituals performed at each stage. It describes the moment of installation, and it presents the entire sequence not as a private legend of a particular monastery, but as the foundational story of an entire civilization. The mainstream view, of course, is that the ark was either destroyed in the Babylonian conquest of Jerusalem, or hidden somewhere within the Temple Mount, or simply lost, with no specific fate recoverable from the surviving texts. The Hebrew Bible itself falls silent on the subject after a certain point. The book of Jeremiah hints in a single passage that the ark would not be missed in the time of restoration, but the text does not say where it had gone. The rabbinic tradition has its own theories. The medieval Christian tradition added others. The Ethiopian claim is one possibility among several, and from the standpoint of conventional biblical scholarship, it is not the most economical explanation. The most economical explanation is that the ark was destroyed, and that all subsequent claims to its survival are, in their various ways, theological rather than historical. But the Ethiopian claim has a feature that the other surviving theories do not have. It comes attached to a continuous institution that has been in place for an extraordinarily long time. It is not a story told by a vanished sect. It is not a fragment recovered from a single damaged manuscript. It is the active, ongoing practice of a major Christian church, observed in the liturgical calendar, observed in the architecture of every Ethiopian Orthodox sanctuary, where a replica of the ark, called the tabot, is kept in the Holy of Holies of every parish and is processed in public during the festival of Timkat each January. Millions of people every year witness the ceremonial display of the tabatat. The replicas are everywhere. The original, if there is an original, is in the chapel at Aksum. What does it mean to take the claim seriously without claiming to verify it? It means, perhaps, to recognize that history is not only made of what can be excavated and dated and authenticated. It is also made of what is believed continuously by communities whose belief shapes their actions across generations. The Ethiopian Orthodox Church has acted, for at least a millennium and a half, as if the ark were in Aksum. It has built its liturgy around that assumption. It has structured its episcopal hierarchy around that assumption. It has, in moments of national crisis, drawn courage from that assumption. The claim is not merely a story about an object. It is the spinal column of a religious civilization, and to dismiss the claim is to fail to understand the civilization itself. There is also a more uncomfortable question, which is whether the modern reluctance to take the claim seriously rests partly on the same set of assumptions that worked, in earlier centuries, to demote Aksum from its place among the four kingdoms. If the Ark of the Covenant had been claimed by a European cathedral, by a French abbey or an Italian basilica, the question would have been investigated for centuries with the full apparatus of relic scholarship. The Holy Lance, the True Cross, the Shroud of Turin, the various skulls and bones of saints. These have been examined exhaustively, debated in scholarly journals, subjected to carbon dating where access could be obtained, written about in popular books that sell in airports. The Ethiopian claim has received nothing of the kind. It has been mentioned in passing, treated as quaint, occasionally written about by enthusiasts whose work has not always met the standards of academic rigour, and otherwise left to the church that maintains it. The asymmetry is itself worth noticing. What might be in the chapel? It might be a stone box of considerable age, brought from somewhere, kept with extraordinary care, of unknown ultimate origin. It might be a replica produced at some point in the late antique or early medieval period, treated thereafter as the original. It might be the genuine Ark of the Book of Exodus in some condition or other, after a journey of 3,000 years. It might be something else entirely, an object the tradition has misnamed for so long that the misnaming has become the truth. There is no way at present to know. The guardian does not show what he guards. The church does not invite inspection. The chapel keeps its silence the way the obelisks at Aksum keep theirs, and the silence is, in its own way, a kind of testimony. Testimony to the patience of a civilization that has been told repeatedly that its memory does not count, and that has continued with quiet stubbornness to count it anyway. There is a small fact about the Aksumite Empire that deserves to be held in the mind for a long moment, because it cuts directly across one of the most persistent assumptions of how Africa has been written about in the European tradition. The fact is this. Between roughly the late 3rd century and the 7th century of the Common Era, the kings of Aksum minted their own coinage in gold, in silver and in bronze. They were the only sub-Saharan African polity to do so for the entire span of antiquity. They were, in fact, one of only a handful of states anywhere in the world during that period to issue coinage in all 3 metals on a sustained basis. Rome did, Persia did, the Aksumites did. The list is short, and the implications of being on that list when one thinks them through are not small. Coinage is a peculiar artifact. It is small enough to slip through the centuries and numbers that monumental architecture cannot. It is durable enough to survive in the soil for 2,000 years without significant corrosion, particularly in the case of gold. It carries, on its 2 faces, a compressed political and religious statement that the issuing authority has chosen with care. The portraits of the kings, the inscriptions in their chosen languages, the symbols of their gods or their successors' gods, the metallic standards by which the coins were weighed, all of these are deliberate. A coin is not an accident of trade. A coin is a declaration. To mint coinage is to announce that one is a state of a particular kind, and that one expects one's coins to circulate beyond one's borders and to carry one's name into the markets of one's neighbours. Aksum minted coins. The neighbours received them. The coins still turn up, in numbers, in archaeological sites across the Indian Ocean rim, and even occasionally in the Mediterranean. What makes the Aksumite coinage particularly striking is the precision with which it was struck. The gold issues were calibrated to the Roman aureus, and later to the solidus, the standard gold currency of the Eastern Mediterranean. This calibration was deliberate. It allowed Aksumite gold to circulate seamlessly with Roman gold in the markets of Adulis, Alexandria, and the ports of the Indian coast. The silver and bronze issues were calibrated to local fractional needs, allowing transactions of varying scales to be conducted in standardized currency. The Greek inscriptions on the earliest issues addressed a Mediterranean audience. The Ge'ez inscriptions on later issues addressed a domestic audience, and the simultaneous use of both languages on the same currency, sometimes on the same coin, signalled that the issuing authority was capable of speaking with confidence to both worlds. There is even a small but significant detail in the metallurgy of certain late issues. The addition of inlaid gold to the surfaces of bronze coins, a technique requiring real metallurgical skill, used to highlight the cross or other religious symbols on the obverse. This technique, the so-called gilded bronze, is unusual in the history of ancient coinage and demonstrates a level of mint sophistication that few contemporary states could match. What does it mean for an empire to mint coinage at this level of competence? It means, at minimum, that the empire had a stable government capable of guaranteeing the metallic content of its currency over a span of generations. It means that the empire had access to the raw materials, gold from the rivers of the African interior, silver and copper from sources still being investigated by archaeologists, in quantities sufficient to support continuous minting. It means that the empire had a workforce of skilled engravers, metallurgists, and mint officials, trained in techniques that required years of apprenticeship and that did not survive accidentally in the hands of farmers or pastoralists. It means, in short, that the Aksumite economy supported the kind of specialized labor that economic historians associate with what they call complex states. None of this is what the colonial-era image of Africa suggested was possible. There is a moment in the historiography of Aksumite coinage that is worth pausing on. When European scholars in the 19th and early 20th centuries first began to systematically catalogue the Aksumite coins that had been brought back from East Africa by travellers and missionaries, the initial assumption among many of them was that the coins must be imitations of Roman coins, struck by some local authority that had wished to mimic the prestige of imperial currency, without producing genuinely independent issues. The assumption was natural, given the framework these scholars brought with them. It was also, when the coins were examined more carefully, plainly wrong. The Aksumite issues bore the names of Aksumite kings in scripts those kings had chosen, with iconography that drew on Aksumite religious and political symbols. They were not imitations, they were originals. The kings whose names appear on them, Endubis, Aphilus, Wazeba, Ezana, Usanus, Caleb, and many others, formed a coherent dynastic sequence that scholars have since been able to reconstruct largely from the coins themselves. The numismatic record, in other words, is one of the principal sources for the very chronology of the empire. Without the coins, much of the king list would not survive. There is one issue, struck during the reign of Endubis in roughly the late 3rd century, that carries on its reverse a small symbol of disputed meaning. It is a curved line above a flat line, and scholars have argued for decades about whether it represents the disk and crescent of the older Aksumite religion, or some other symbol drawn from local cosmology. The dispute is, in a small way, a microcosm of the larger interpretive challenge that the empire poses. The visual vocabulary of Aksum drew on multiple sources: South Arabian, Hellenistic, indigenous African, and later Christian. And the resulting iconography is dense, layered, and not always reducible to single-source explanations. To read an Aksumite coin is to read a small composite document whose elements were chosen in each case to communicate something specific to a particular audience, and to reconstruct what the audience would have understood requires holding several traditions in the mind at once. What is perhaps most important about the coinage in the end is not its technical sophistication or its artistic refinement, though both are considerable. What is most important is that it constitutes a continuous archaeological refutation of a story that the modern world has often been told about the African past. The story holds that complex states with standardized currency, monumental architecture, written languages, and integration into the long-distance trade networks of antiquity were not produced south of the Sahara. The Aksumite coins, in their thousands, sit in the museum drawers of Europe and North America and East Africa, quietly disproving that story. They've been disproving it for as long as they have been studied. The story has nevertheless persisted, because stories of that kind do not yield easily to evidence. They yield only to attention, and the attention has until recently been thin. The coins are still being found. Hoards still surface occasionally when farmers in the highlands turn the soil with their ploughs. Each new hoard adds another small voice to the testimony. The voices are small, They are individually the size of a thumbnail, but there are thousands of them, and together they speak with a clarity that the silence of the textbooks has not entirely been able to drown out. There is a strait of water between Africa and Arabia where the two continents reach toward each other across the southern end of the Red Sea, narrowing at one point to a passage so slender that on a clear morning from the African shore, the Arabian coast can be seen as a low blue line on the eastern horizon. The strait is called Bab el-Mandeb, the Gate of Tears, a name whose origin is uncertain but whose mood the strait still carries. Across this passage, in the early 6th century after Christ, an Aksumite army crossed in ships, landed on the Arabian shore, and conducted a campaign that ended with an African empire ruling territory on a second continent. The campaign is one of the more remarkable episodes in the history of late antiquity, and it is also one of the least often told. An African Christian king sent his fleet across the sea, deposed a Jewish king who ruled in southern Arabia, and installed a Christian governor in his place. The world, for a brief period in the 6th century, contained an Aksumite imperial province in what is now Yemen. The kingdom on the Arabian side was called Himyar. It had risen, in the centuries before, as the political successor to the older South Arabian kingdoms whose temples and inscriptions still dot the highlands of Yemen. Himyar had begun in the polytheistic religious tradition of the region, with its moon and sun gods and its astronomical calendars, but somewhere in the late 4th or early 5th century it had undergone a religious transformation of its own. Its kings had converted to Judaism. Whether this was a formal conversion of the entire ruling class or a more gradual adoption of monotheistic vocabulary by a court that retained older syncretic elements is still debated by scholars. What is not debated is that by the early 6th century, the kings of Himyar were issuing inscriptions that named the God of Israel, that referenced the writings of the Hebrew Bible, and that rejected the Trinitarian formulations of the Christian Church to the north and east. The collision between this Jewish kingdom and the Christian world around it came to a crisis in the second decade of the 6th century, under a Himyarite king whose name in the Arabic sources is given as Du Nuwas. Du Nuwas appears to have viewed the Christian communities in his territory, particularly the substantial Christian population of the city of Najran in northern Yemen, as a political threat, a fifth column potentially loyal to the Aksumite Empire across the strait, or to the Byzantine Empire farther north. He moved against them. The accounts of what followed are preserved in several sources, in Greek, in Syriac, in Ge'ez, and in the Arabic histories that came later, and they are, in their substance, remarkably consistent. There was a massacre at Najran. Christians who refused to renounce their faith were killed. The numbers given by the sources are large, perhaps inflated by the rhetoric of martyrdom, but the underlying event, a deliberate persecution of a Christian community by a Jewish monarchy in southern Arabia, is well attested. The news of what had happened travelled north and west. It reached the Aksumite court, and the Aksumite king on the throne, at that moment, whose name in the Ge'ez sources is Caleb, and in the Greek sources is Elesboas, made the decision to respond with military force. The campaign that followed was extraordinary by any standard. Caleb assembled a fleet, by some accounts with logistical support from the Byzantine Empire, which had its own reasons to support a Christian intervention against a regime that had killed Christians. The fleet crossed Bab el-Mandeb. The Aksumite army landed on the Arabian coast, marched inland and engaged the forces of Du Nuwas. The Himyarite king was defeated and killed, by some accounts driving his horse into the sea rather than be captured. The Aksumites occupied the country. A Christian governor was installed. Churches were built. The southern Arabian Peninsula, for the first time in its recorded history, became a province of an African empire. The occupation did not last forever. but it lasted long enough to leave a mark. The governor whom Caleb installed was eventually replaced by what mechanism is not entirely clear, by an Aksumite general named Abraha, who broke with the home government and ruled Yemen as a quasi-independent monarch for several decades. Abraha is a figure whose name survives oddly in the Quran, in the chapter known as Al-Fil, the elephant, which refers to a campaign Abraha is said to have launched against Mecca in the year of the Prophet Muhammad's birth. The campaign, according to the tradition, was destroyed by divine intervention before it could reach the city. The historicity of the specific details is debated, but the existence of Abraha as an Aksumite, descended ruler in Yemen during this period, is securely attested by his own inscriptions, which still survive on stones in the Yemeni highlands. He governed Yemen in the late 6th century. He built or restored a great cathedral at Sana'a, whose magnificence is described in the later Arab sources. He conducted his administration in a fusion of Aksumite and South Arabian traditions. He was, by all available evidence, a serious imperial figure operating at the seam between two civilizations. What does it mean for an African empire to have held territory in Arabia for the better part of a century? It means, in the most direct sense, that the conventional geographic framing of late antique imperial history is wrong. The standard map of the 6th century world shows the Byzantine Empire, the Sasanian Empire, and a fringe of smaller polities around their edges. Aksum is sometimes shown, sometimes not, as a small territory in the African Horn. What the standard map does not show is the period of perhaps 50 or 60 years during which Aksum extended itself across the Red Sea and held a province on the Arabian Peninsula, becoming for that period a transcontinental empire of a kind that the African continent is rarely credited with producing. The fact has been documented for over a century. It has been written about in scholarly journals, in monographs, in specialist histories. It has not, however, made its way into the mental map of late antiquity that most educated readers carry with them. The mental map continues, by inertia, to show what it has long shown. There is a second, deeper question raised by the Himayarite campaign, which is what it tells us about the religious geography of the early 6th century world. In the conventional telling, the religions of late antiquity are arranged along familiar lines: Christianity to the north, Zoroastrianism to the east, the older polytheisms in retreat, Judaism a diaspora phenomenon scattered through the cities of the Roman world. The campaign of Caleb against Dunuas does not fit this map. It is a war between an African Christian kingdom and an Arabian Jewish kingdom, fought across a strait of water in the southern Red Sea over the fate of Christian communities living under Jewish rule. None of these phrases match the categories that the conventional history books prefer, and yet the war happened. The inscriptions survive. The accounts in 5 languages corroborate one another. The world of late antiquity, when one looks at it directly, was stranger and more variegated than the textbook simplifications suggest, and the Empire of Aksum was, for a brief and astonishing moment, one of the active shaping powers of that strangeness. There is a particular silence that settles over the historical record of Aksum in the 7th century, and it is not the silence of a sudden end. It is the silence of a slow withdrawal, of a great empire gradually folding inward upon itself, drawing its borders smaller, allowing its outermost holdings to slip from its grasp, until the polity that survives in the highlands no longer resembles the imperial power that once sent its armies across the sea. There is no decisive battle that ends Aksum. There is no sack of the capital, no documented moment of conquest, no inscription announcing the fall of the dynasty. The empire simply diminishes year by year, decade by decade, until at some point in the late 7th or early 8th century, the Aksumite mint stops striking coins, The great inscriptions cease to be carved. The trade through Adulis falls below the threshold at which foreign merchants find it worth recording, and the kingdom that had once been counted among the four great powers of the world is no longer counted by anyone outside its own borders. What happened? The question has occupied historians for over a century, and the answers they have proposed have multiplied rather than converged. The first explanation usually offered, and the one with the most circumstantial evidence behind it, has to do with climate. The northern Ethiopian highlands had supported their dense population and their elaborate agriculture by means of rainfall patterns that, in the centuries of the empire's flourishing, were more generous than they later became. Pollen records from lake sediments in the region, studied by paleoclimatologists in recent decades, suggest that beginning sometime in the 6th century and accelerating into the 7th, the rains diminished, the forests retreated, the cultivable land contracted. Agricultural yields fell, whatever the precise mechanisms, shifts in the monsoon system, broader changes in the climate of the late antique world that have been linked to volcanic eruptions and to the so-called late antique Little Ice Age. The result on the ground was that the empire's heartland could no longer feed the population it had once supported. Cities shrank. Outlying settlements were abandoned. The economic base that had sustained the imperial apparatus thinned beneath it. This climatic explanation does not stand alone. It interacts with a second factor, which is the great pandemic that swept through the Mediterranean and surrounding regions, beginning in the year 541. The plague of Justinian, named for the Byzantine emperor, on whose watch it began, killed an enormous proportion of the population of every region it touched. Estimates vary widely, but recent studies suggest that in some areas the mortality reached levels comparable to the Black Death of the 14th century. The plague entered the Mediterranean world by the most credible accounts, through the trade ports of the Red Sea and the eastern African coast. It is more than likely that Adulis, as one of the major nodes in that network, was among the cities through which the disease passed in its early years. What that meant for the population of the Aksumite Empire has not been precisely measured, because the kind of demographic records that allow such measurement do not exist for the kingdom. But it is reasonable to assume that an empire whose prosperity depended on long-distance trade, and whose principal port was a likely vector for the disease, suffered losses that compounded the agricultural difficulties already unfolding. There is a third factor, perhaps the most consequential of all, which is the rise of Islam and the consequent transformation of the Red Sea trade in the 7th century. When the new religious movement that began in the cities of Western Arabia in the early 7th century expanded, in the decades after the death of its prophet, into a political and military empire that absorbed the Sasanian state and stripped the Byzantines of their southern provinces, the geography of long-distance trade was rewritten. The Red Sea, which had for centuries been the principal commercial corridor connecting the Mediterranean to the Indian Ocean, became, in effect, a body of water bordered on its eastern shore by a single rapidly expanding power. The new caliphate did not need Aksumite middlemen to broker its commerce. It traded directly with India, with East Africa, with the Mediterranean ports it now controlled. The Aksumite economic role, the role of intermediary that had made the empire wealthy, was suddenly redundant. There was a peculiar early courtesy in the relationship. The prophet himself is said to have advised his early followers, when they were persecuted in Mecca, to seek refuge with the Aksumite king who received them and protected them, and this courtesy persisted in the early Islamic memory of the empire as a uniquely just non-Muslim kingdom. But courtesy did not preserve trade. The trade went elsewhere. The port at Adulis, deprived of the volume that had sustained it, declined. The customs revenues that had filled the Aksumite treasury thinned. The economic engine of the empire, having lost the climate that supplied it and the population that worked it, also lost the commerce that had monetized its outputs. These three factors, climate, plague, and the closure of the Red Sea trade to non-Islamic intermediaries, are sometimes presented as alternative explanations, as if one could choose among them. The more honest reading is that they reinforced one another. A weakened agricultural base meant that population losses to plague were harder to recover from. Reduced population meant that trade volumes could not be maintained even on the routes that remained open. Reduced trade revenues meant that the imperial centre could not subsidize the regions that climate had impoverished. The decline of Aksum is, in other words, a textbook example of a complex civilization unravelling because the various supports on which it had stood were eroding simultaneously, and because no single intervention could have saved a system that was failing in multiple dimensions at once. There is also a fourth factor that deserves mention, more speculative than the others but worth considering. The Aksumite royal court appears, in the surviving inscriptions, to have moved its centre of gravity southward over the course of the 7th and 8th centuries, away from the city of Aksum itself and into territories deeper in the highlands, where the political and military pressures of the changing world were less acute. The capital was, in effect, abandoned, though never formally renounced. The kings continued to claim Aksum as their seat. They simply stopped being there. This kind of slow capital migration is not unusual in the history of declining empires. The late Roman world saw something analogous in the various imperial residences that supplemented and eventually replaced Rome itself. But in the Aksumite case it had a particular consequence, which was that the city of Aksum, with its monuments and its religious significance and its accumulated centuries of court memory, became a kind of ceremonial relic of the empire, while the actual political life of the country moved to places whose names the wider world had not yet learned. When the wider world stopped looking at the highlands, it was looking at a city that was emptying, while elsewhere, out of sight, the descendants of the empire were quietly reorganizing themselves into something that would survive, but survive in a different form, under different names, on different terrain. There is a town in the central Ethiopian highlands, perched at an elevation of about 2,500 meters, where 11 churches have been carved out of solid volcanic rock. They are not built. They are not assembled from stones quarried elsewhere and brought to a site. They are excavated, the way a sculptor excavates a statue from a block of marble. Only here the block is a hillside, and what has been removed is everything that is not church. The churches descend into the earth rather than rising from it. One walks downward into them through trenches cut from the surface. Their roofs are at ground level, their interiors are below. To stand at the rim of one of these excavations and look down into the cruciform shape of the building below is to experience a particular kind of vertigo, a sense that what one is looking at shouldn't be possible, that the labour required to produce it cannot be reconciled with any reasonable estimate of medieval African resources, and that the vision behind it must have come from a source that the conventional history of the period does not adequately explain. The town is called Lalibela. The churches were carved by the most widely accepted dating, the late 12th and early 13th centuries of the Common Era. They're sometimes called the eighth wonder of the world. They are not particularly well known outside the regions of their immediate cultural inheritance. Lalibela was not the work of the Aksumite Empire. The Aksumite Empire had, by the time these churches were carved, been gone for several centuries. But Lalibela is the work of a dynasty that emerged from the long aftermath of the Aksumite collapse, and it tells, in its impossible architecture, a story about what happened to the memory of Aksum during the centuries when the wider world assumed that nothing was happening in the highlands at all. The dynasty was called the Zagwe, Its kings ruled from a capital further south than Aksum, in a region now known as Lasta. Its origins are murky. The chronicles that survive from later periods, written largely under the dynasty that displaced the Zagwe, present them in unflattering terms, as usurpers, as a non-Solomonic line, as an interruption in the proper succession of legitimate kings. This kind of after-the-fact disparagement is the standard treatment that any displaced dynasty receives at the hands of its successors, and one should read the chronicles with the appropriate skepticism. What the Zagwe actually were, what they understood themselves to be, what they accomplished during their roughly 3-century rule, is harder to reconstruct than the chronicles suggest, because the Zagwe themselves did not leave behind a substantial body of self-documentation. What they left behind was Lalibela. The town is named for the king who is traditionally credited with commissioning the churches, a Zagwe ruler named Gebre Meskel Lalibela, who reigned in the late 12th and early 13th centuries. The tradition holds that he had a vision in which he was transported to the heavenly Jerusalem, and that upon his return he resolved to build, in the African highlands, a new Jerusalem, a sacred city that would replicate in its physical layout the holy geography of the original. There is a small river running through the town that the local tradition calls the Jordan. There are churches named for the apostles, for the Virgin, for the Saviour. The arrangement of the 11 structures has been read by some scholars as a deliberate cartographic statement, a built theology that mapped the holy sites of Christendom onto the African ground. Whether the king himself intended this in the way the tradition presents it, or whether the layout acquired its full symbolic significance through later interpretation is difficult to determine. What is not difficult to determine is that the project was conceived on a scale and executed with a precision that places it among the more remarkable achievements of medieval architecture anywhere in the world. How were the churches carved? The technique, by the best modern reconstruction, involved the cutting of a deep rectangular trench around what would become the perimeter of the building, leaving a solid block of rock standing in the middle. From this block, then, the masons cut downward and inward, removing material to create the walls, the columns, the roof, the windows, and finally the interior chambers. The doors and windows were cut at the appropriate moments to admit light into the deepening interior. The carving had to be planned with extraordinary care, because there is no way to add material that has been removed, and because the rock, being a single piece of basalt, cannot be patched if it is overcut. A mistake in the carving of one of these churches would not be repairable. None of the 11 churches show evidence of significant repair. They were, apparently, executed correctly the first time by people whose names have not survived, working with tools whose specifications are not entirely known in a region whose contemporary written record does not describe what was happening on the rock. The continuity between Aksum and Lalibela, beneath the discontinuity of dynasty, is the continuity of an idea that the African highlands were a sacred Christian geography in their own right, that they did not need to look northward toward Jerusalem or eastward toward Alexandria to find their religious legitimacy, that the holy could be carved into their own ground. This is a striking claim, and the Zagwe pursued it with a confidence that the wider Christian world would not have predicted in a kingdom that had, on the standard accounts, been written off as a peripheral remnant of a vanished empire. Whatever the wider world thought, the kings at Lalibela acted as if they were still at the centre of something important, and they built accordingly. After the fall of the Zagwe in the late 13th century, a new dynasty came to power that called itself Solomonic, claiming descent from Menelik, son of Solomon and Makeda, and therefore from the original royal line that the Aksumite kings had also claimed. This dynasty, which would rule Ethiopia under various forms until its formal abolition in the 20th century, treated the Aksumite period as its prestigious origin and the Zagwe period as a regrettable interruption. But the line of inheritance, traced honestly, does not run cleanly. The Solomonic kings governed from a series of capitals further south and east of Aksum. Their territory expanded beyond the old Aksumite heartland into the southern highlands and the lakes region. They produced their own monuments, their own chronicles, their own ecclesiastical literature, including the Kebra Nagast itself, which was compiled in something close to its surviving form during the early Solomonic period. The kingdom that they ruled was in continuous descent the inheritor of Aksum, but it was also a different kingdom, with a different centre, a different scale, and a different relationship to the wider world. The Aksumite Empire had been a Red Sea power. The Solomonic kingdom was by the time of its full flowering a more inland power, oriented toward the highlands and the southern frontiers, with reduced involvement in the maritime trade that had once defined its predecessor. The continuity was real, so was the change, and the world outside, having stopped paying attention during the dim centuries between, did not catch up. There is a peculiar sentence in the academic literature of the 19th century that, once read, tends to lodge itself in the mind and refuse to be dislodged. The sentence appears, in various phrasings, in the works of European scholars writing about the antiquities of northeastern Africa during the height of the colonial era, and its substance is consistent across the various authors who produced versions of it. The substance is this, that the civilizations of the African highlands, whose monuments and inscriptions and coinages had become impossible to ignore by the late 19th century, must have been the work of an outside racial element. A wave of light-skinned migrants from southern Arabia, or from some more distant origin, who had brought civilization with them and imposed it upon the indigenous population, and who had then either been absorbed by that population or had withdrawn, leaving behind monuments that the locals could no longer comprehend. This proposition, which came to be known as the Hamitic hypothesis, was not a marginal view. It was the dominant interpretive framework through which European scholarship approached the African past for the better part of a century. It shaped the textbooks, it shaped the museum labels, it shaped the assumptions that visiting travellers brought with them when they wrote their accounts of what they had seen, and it was, when examined closely, almost entirely without empirical foundation. The hypothesis worked by what is sometimes called a circular epistemology. It began with the assumption that complex civilizations were not produced by sub-Saharan African populations. When evidence of complex civilizations in sub-Saharan Africa was encountered, Aksum, Great Zimbabwe, the medieval kingdoms of West Africa, the Swahili city-states of the East African coast, the evidence was not allowed to revise the assumption. Instead, the evidence was reinterpreted to fit the assumption. The civilizations must have been built by outsiders. The outsiders must have been racially distinct from the local population. The local population, having received civilization from the outsiders, had subsequently degenerated, lost the techniques, and was now incapable of explaining what its ancestors had done. This reasoning was applied, with varying levels of explicitness, to nearly every major archaeological discovery on the continent for several decades. It was applied to Great Zimbabwe so insistently that for years the colonial government of what was then Rhodesia officially required guidebooks to attribute the ruins to Phoenicians or to other non-African builders, and discouraged any presentation of the site that acknowledged its actual indigenous origin. In the case of Aksum, the application of the hypothesis took a particular form. Because there were genuine cultural connections between the African highlands and southern Arabia, connections in script, in religion, in architectural detail, these connections were interpreted as evidence of an Arabian colonization of Africa, in which Sabaean migrants had crossed the Red Sea, established a civilization, and gradually been absorbed by the African population. The genuine cultural connections were real. Their interpretation was forced. The connections could equally well be explained, and have since been better explained, as the result of a long-running cultural and economic exchange between two adjacent regions, neither of which was the source and neither of which was the recipient, both of which were participants in a shared maritime world. But for as long as the Hamitic framework dominated, the explanation was constrained. The civilization had to come from outside. It could not have grown from where it stood. What the hypothesis accomplished in the long arc of its influence was a kind of intellectual erasure that complemented the political erasure being conducted simultaneously by the colonial powers themselves. While European armies were drawing borders across the continent and asserting sovereignty over territories whose previous political histories were dismissed as either non-existent or insufficiently sophisticated to count, European scholarship was producing the textual apparatus that justified the dismissal. The two processes were not identical. They were related. The textbook that placed Aksum in a paragraph and Rome in a chapter was not directly serving any imperial policy, but it was operating within a frame of value that imperial policy had helped to shape. And the cumulative effect was that an empire which had been counted by many as one of the four great kingdoms of the world had become, by the early 20th century, a footnote whose existence was acknowledged only when it could not be avoided. There is a second mechanism of erasure, less explicit than the Hamitic hypothesis, but in some ways more durable, which has to do with the structure of academic specialization itself. The study of the ancient Mediterranean world is, in most universities, organized around departments of classics, ancient history, and biblical studies. These departments draw their canonical texts from Greek, Latin, and Hebrew. They draw their secondary texts from a corpus of scholarship written, for the most part, in English, French, German, and Italian over the past several centuries. The languages of Aksum, Ge'ez, the various South Arabian scripts, the Greek of the Aksumite inscriptions, which falls outside the standard classical curriculum, are taught in a small handful of programs scattered across the world, and the scholars trained in them are correspondingly few. The result is that even when an interested student wishes to learn about Aksum in depth, the institutional supports that would make such study easy are, in most places, simply absent. The student must seek out unusual programs, find advisors with the relevant linguistic skills, build their own bibliography out of fragments of literature that the larger fields of ancient history have not integrated. This is not the result of any deliberate suppression. It is the result of inertia, of the path dependence of academic structures that were established at a time when the Hamitic hypothesis still had substantial influence, and that have not been fully reorganized in the decades since the hypothesis lost its scholarly credibility. There is a third mechanism more diffuse and harder to point to, which is the simple matter of cultural attention. The civilizations that the Anglophone world remembers most vividly are the civilizations whose monuments have been most photographed, whose stories have been most novelized, whose myths have been most adapted into films. Egypt is remembered because the pyramids have been photographed for 2 centuries and because the Nile features in countless productions of popular culture. Rome is remembered because every educated reader has been exposed to the standard narratives of the Republic and the Empire from childhood. Aksum is not remembered because none of these reinforcement mechanisms have ever operated on its behalf. The obelisks have been photographed, but not at the saturation level of the pyramids. The chronicles have been translated, but not into the languages of mass entertainment. The kings have not been the subject of widely circulated biographies. The empire exists in the scholarly literature, but it does not exist in the cultural imagination, and the gap between the two is what makes the erasure persistent even now, when the explicit racial frameworks that produced the original demotion have been formally abandoned. What can be done about this? The honest answer is that erasures of this magnitude do not reverse quickly. They reverse, when they reverse at all, through the slow accumulation of attention from those who choose, individually, to look. Each book that takes Aksum seriously contributes a small weight to the rebalancing. Each documentary that visits the obelisks contributes another. Each conversation in which someone says casually that there were once 4 great empires in the ancient world, and one of them was in Africa, does its small work against the inertia of forgetting. The empire is not waiting to be excavated. It has already been excavated. It is waiting, more simply, to be remembered. There is in the field at Aksum, where the great stelae stand and lie, a particular hour just before sunset, when the light from the west lengthens the shadows of the standing stones across the grass, and brings out the carved windows on their faces in a relief that is almost theatrical. The fallen stele, the one that broke when it fell, or that fell because it broke, lies along the ground in segments that the grass has grown around, the way grass grows around any large object that has been still long enough. Tourists walking among the stones, when there are tourists, sometimes pause beside the fallen one and try to take in its length with the eye, and find that the eye does not quite manage. The thing is too long for ordinary perception. It refuses to be summarized. It lies there in pieces, asking nothing of the visitor and offering nothing in return, the way old objects do when they have outlived the civilization that gave them meaning. What does it mean to stand beside a stone like that? It means, perhaps, to encounter the limits of what history can do with what has been left behind. The stone can be measured, its weight can be estimated, its quarry can be located, the traces of the tools that worked it can be identified. All of this can be done, and has been done, and is on file in the archaeological literature. None of it answers the question of what the stone was for, in the full sense in which the people who carved it would have understood the word for. The carvers had a purpose. The purpose was conceived inside a civilization that was confident enough in itself to believe that purposes of that magnitude could be conceived and executed. That civilization is gone. The stone remains. The relationship between the stone and the modern observer is not the relationship the stone was designed for. The observer stands outside the assumptions that gave the stone its place. The stone, in some quiet way, is a fragment of a frame of mind that has not survived in any other form. This is perhaps the deepest of the silences that the Empire of Aksum has left behind. Not the silence of its own destruction, which was modest. Not the silence of its political erasure, which has been at least partially recoverable, but the silence of a worldview, a way of understanding the highlands, the Red Sea, the relationship of an African plateau to the wider currents of late antiquity. That no longer exists in the form the Aksumites possessed it. The modern Ethiopian Orthodox Church preserves elements of it in liturgy and in architecture and in the slow rhythms of religious time. The Chronicles preserve elements of it in their cadences and their assumptions. The Kebra Nagast preserves elements of it in the long arc of its origin story. But the integrated whole, the way an Aksumite courtier would have understood his own world, the cosmology, the political theology, the sense of where one stood among the kingdoms of the earth, that is not recoverable. It is gone the way the world views of all vanished civilizations are gone, leaving behind only the partial survivals that subsequent generations have managed to translate into terms they can understand. There is a phrase that recurs in various forms in the writings of scholars who have worked closely with the material remains of vanished civilizations. The phrase is some version of the recognition that the past, even when it is materially abundant, is also irreducibly absent. The stones can be touched, the coins can be held, The inscriptions can be read, but the people who made them are not available for questioning, and the meanings they assign to their own products are reconstructions performed at a distance, with imperfect tools, by interpreters who carry their own assumptions into the work. Every history of Aksum is, in this sense, a partial history. Every history of any vanished civilization is. What has been recovered is real, but it is also a small fraction of what was once there. The rest is silence. What, then, is the right response to a silence of this magnitude? It is not, perhaps, the rush to fill it with confident reconstructions, which can only ever be approximate. Nor is it the resigned shrug of those who declare the past irrecoverable and therefore unworthy of close attention. The right response, perhaps, is something more patient, a willingness to sit with the silence, to listen to the partial voices that do survive, to allow the stones their dignity as objects whose full meaning is no longer available, and to refuse at the same time to let the partial voices be drowned out by the louder narratives that have dominated for too long. This is the kind of attention that the Empire of Aksum has rarely received, and that it would, if it could ask for anything, perhaps ask for now. There is a small image that recurs for those who think about these things when the question of what to do with forgotten civilizations is raised. The image is of a stone, any of the stones, but particularly the fallen one at Aksum, standing or lying at the edge of a field, with a person walking towards it across the grass. The person does not know, when they begin walking, what they will think when they arrive. They know only that the stone is there, that it has been there for a very long time, and that they have decided to walk toward it rather than away. What they will discover when they arrive is partial. What they will fail to discover will be, in the nature of the case, far greater. But the walking itself is the act that matters, and the walking is something each person can do in their own way, in their own time, in whatever direction the stones of their own forgotten histories are calling them. The empire was real, the kings were real, the fleets that crossed Bab el-Mandeb were real, the coins in the museum drawers are real, the chapel at Aksum with its single guardian is real, and what it holds, whatever it holds, is real in some sense that the modern world has not fully decided how to describe. None of this depends on being remembered to be real. The empire existed whether or not the textbooks acknowledged it. The continent produced civilizations on its own terms, in its own languages, by its own traditions, regardless of whether the cartographers of later centuries chose to draw them into their maps. What is at stake in remembering, then, is not the existence of these things, which is settled, but the relationship between the present and the past, whether the present is the kind of place that can hold the past honestly, or the kind of place that prefers a tidier version, simpler in its outlines, easier to teach. The stones at Aksum will continue to stand or to lie, depending on which one is looked at. They've stood and lain through centuries in which they were forgotten, and through other centuries in which they were partially remembered, and they will outlast the present hour with the same patience they have shown for everything else. What they ask, if stones can be said to ask, is not very much. They ask only that someone occasionally walk across the grass toward them and look. The looking is the thing, everything else, in its slow way, follows from that.